quick orientation to the VR template version 2. Looking down here at the content browser, all the stuff that is part of the template is in this folder. I've included the Unreal official virtual reality template in case you needed it for some reason in the mobile starter content. Looking in here, we can first start at the maps. The listen start map is the one you'll open up on. If you don't know, if you want to change which maps open, so try that open on the other screen. Open up your project settings, go to maps and modes, and you can change that all here. So the listen start map, just to show you what's going on inside the level blueprint. Open on the other screen again. By default, it's going to look for a LAN session. If it finds one, it'll join it. If it doesn't find one, it'll make its own as a listen server. So then the next person on your LAN to join will join it. If you want to use dedicated server, you need to do something different because the sessions don't work with that. You'll use this. But if you're compiling your own editor for the dedicated server, you can figure that stuff out. Okay, and then that's all the startup map does. If you're doing a dedicated server, that server has its own startup map, and all it does is go here and it points to a different map. It's not strictly necessary. Transition map that has nothing on it. And then the template map, which is just a slightly modified default VR map. Let's go through the folders. Art at the top, just some stuff that comes with it. I made a little model of a gun and some stuff. This is all the hand stuff, which I obviously didn't make. This is Epic's. I've just modified some stuff, and this is where I am keeping it. For blueprints, just two subfolders. Items. The grandpa item is this foundation one that's in all caps. This is the one you won't actually use in the level, but it's going to be the parent item that holds all the functionality, and then you'll want to create child blueprints, as these are for your actual ones. Pawn's in here. Framework stuff. The only ones you really need to know about are game mode. Actually, there's only three. So game state I ended up not needing to do anything with, but the player controller does a little bit, and the game mode does a little bit. We already went over maps, and this is where we keep all the custom structs and enums and libraries and other stuff that starts to clutter up your other folders, but you do actually need, and you will probably use frequently. Okay, let's get into the pawn real quick. Bloop. All right. Starting from the event graph, missing from original. Oh no, actually, I did that this morning. Okay, so when you start, you know what? Great point. In order to know about what really happens when you start, we've got to start with the game mode. And if you haven't done a lot of multiplayer stuff or advanced Unreal game making, that you might not have had to deal with the game mode before. What the game mode does, basically, this is just some setup crap. The important part about the game mode that I want you to look at is right here where it says event on post login, and it's where whenever you connect to the server, this event fires and it sends your player controller into this array. And basically, I one at a time take them out of the array, spawn the pawn, and tell it to be possessed by your player controller. And there's also some options for setting up pawn variables on start and starting some actions on the pawn itself. Okay, so anyway, all that's going to happen anytime a pawn gets called. The pawn is actually going to get called from the game mode. You'll notice over here we don't have a default pawn class. That's just going to clutter stuff up. So you join, the game mode figures out what to do with you. Ultimately, it will spawn a pawn for you. Okay. What do we do on a fresh spawn? Well, not that much. Here's some variables and stuff that it indicates. And I'm just going to run through this quickly so that you're aware of where everything is rather than going over how each function actually works, because that could take a few hours, and I'm not interested in doing that. This is the post possession that was called from the game mode. Some of this is updating items. This is, I think, not the best way to update items that have been changed from their initial state. Like if you join a game in progress, this is the thing that updates those items. There's better ways to do that, but this is the way that I've done it because you're gonna go and customize it anyway. This is a way that's easy for you to see and understand. Hey, this is the idea of what it's doing, and then you can go and make it your own and make it better. Okay, and this checks the world gravity override. So in the world settings for this map, you can see there's override world gravity. If you have this unticked, then you just have like normal regular gravity. Tick it and keep this at 0, and then you have 0 gravity. You may enjoy that or need it or whatever. But the pawn has a little bit different functionality depending on what kind of map he's in. If he's in a map with gravity or a map without gravity. Okay, so what happens on every tick? Well, the first thing we do is we decide, is this locally controlled, meaning, um, is this actually running on the computer of the person who owns this pawn? Because there's a copy of the pawn running on everyone's computer and on the server. And what this does is it says, okay, well, is this copy running on the person that owns it or someone else's? And if it's someone else's, then it says, well, okay, what I want to do is I want to apply the variables that the person who does own it sent to the server and have that just update the transforms for the pawn. And at the end, this is actually at the end, as you can see in the sequence, but conceptually it makes sense to start it now. What it basically does is it looks at all your transforms, and it looks at some other data like your hand animations, gathers them, sends it to the server where those variables are replicated here. And then what we looked at before was this one. This is where everyone else who isn't you replicates it so that they know what you're doing. This is just junk debugging stuff that comes after. Okay. Again, this comes after all the good stuff, but conceptually, just so that you know, anything you either just needs to reset after everything else is done, I've just dumped it over here. Okay, moving right along. So in the controls screen, it's kind of big. It's not that complicated though. So input polling and input interrupts. So polling is like stuff. It's every tick I'm asking you, hey, what are the values for these different controller states or these different controller variables, blah, blah, blah. Interrupts fire events once when you start or end pressing a button. And sometimes they interact. Like, so for example, your grip might be binary, or that is to say, might want to run from this side as an interrupt, or it might run from this side as a axis, depending on your hardware. You might not have an axis. It might be binary, and then the axis won't actually give you anything. So I think a vibe is that way. So in which case you'll want to set it up so that the vibe automatically enables binary grip, yes. And then what that does here is it tells it, okay, well, let's manually set the axis at 1 or 0. Okay. That's inputs on the same page. Apply the inputs. Okay. So depending on whether or not there's gravity, there are some inputs for thrusters and brakes. So if there's no gravity, thrusters and brakes. If there is gravity, you have teleport and jump as an interrupt, so it doesn't need to be called on tick. And then rotation and locomotion. And I'll just go through those in the order that I see them here. Okay. Hand thrusters, the blue things are mark where you can change what the controls do. Okay. This is how it applies the thrust, blah, 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 rotation. There's an option to do chunky rotation or smooth rotation. Just set this variable smooth rod, and then I think there's a a variable for how chunky or how smooth to make it. Locomotion. This is where it takes your inputs from your hand, make sure you're allowed to, and then it applies impulse for the locomotion. Brakes, same thing. Jump, only in cases where we actually have gravity. This is where it lets you jump. And then teleportation, this is where it finds a target for teleportation. Okay, I've released the button. Okay, if I've released the button and now it's targeting, then let's teleport you over there. And these three in sequence do that. Okay, body move. These are a little bit complicated, but luckily I don't think you'll have to get into them too much. The important thing to know about the body is that it basically consists of looking at this. It consists of the VR origin, which stays in the same spot in real space in your room. That's going to be static. Camera, which moves, that's your HMD, and then your body, which usually follows your HMD, but not always. And then I've got a diagram out there that I'll post a link to that shows how these three interact, because it depends whether or not you're using 360 locomotion or you're being interacted with by physics or you're moving in room scale. Those things interact in different ways. So it's actually kind of cyclical. They all affect each other. Anyway, here's where all that movement happens. So mag foot anchor, this is the variable that shows whether or not you're walking. Whether you're in 0G or not, it pretends as if it treats it the same as if you've got magnetic boots on, and that means that you're stuck to the floor. Here's where all this happens. And then hand anchor move is when you are moving by gripping a wall or something. Okay? Okay. These get a little bit complicated, but not as complicated as this. So we're checking for collision on a number of places, and then doing a number of things with the results of that. So maybe you get bounced, maybe you have to get reset to another position, maybe we have to just push you back. If you're trying to walk over a cliff, I have it so that you don't walk over cliffs, you slide along cliffs. Same with walls. You don't just bounce right off a wall, but neither do you walk through it. You just sort of slide along it so that it does what you think it should do. But that's all a little bit complicated. So these show the traces, and then what it does with the traces, it usually sets variables and calls some functions. Again, not going to go through these because they are real complicated. Not on the tick event, but on these are all called by separate events, sort of related to the collision, is specialty movement type things. So if you're moving via hand anchor, like you're climbing up a wall, this is the one that makes sure that you don't go through the wall, that you slide along it, you don't bounce off it or anything. This makes sure that you slide along the wall when you're walking on a wall. This is the edge slide, so that you slide along the edge and don't fall off it. If you want to fall off the edge, hold down the sprint key and you fly right off, or you can just modify it so that you fall off by default. I think jumper is the variable there that'll make that happen. I think jumper is automatically set to yes when you start sprinting. Okay, back to this adjust body. I kind of got sick of the way that my different hardware would treat your height. They would do it differently and sort of inconsistently depending on when you last reset it or where your headset was when you picked it up. And so this just sets your height to be whatever the highest position your headset is held at for 5 seconds. And then the capsule updates to be the correct size to match where your head currently is. You can get rid of that and probably be fine, or do your own thing. That's a little idiosyncratic. Basic hand stuff, meaning. Um, First, we have some variables having to do with the controls. They come in handy. Um, we determine, okay, given what those controls are, what target state is your hand trying to do? That is to say, is it trying to make a fist? This isn't to say that it is making a fist or it necessarily will make a fist, but that you've pressed the grip and the trigger button, and we've decided that when you press those together, that means that you are trying to make a fist. And then later it will decide, okay, if you're trying to make a fist, you meet the qualifications to do that. Um, and these are the action targets, meaning these are the states that you want to be in, whether you're open, holding, anchoring, or you have a closed fist. So if you get to the right input state for closed fist and you meet all the requirements for it, and I think the requirement is just that you're not holding something, um, well, this is your action target, and your action target will well, it's somewhere. We'll get to it. Anyway, there's a long chain of events from you pushing a button on your controller to it doing something. And this looks complicated and convoluted and unnecessary, but what it makes it easy to do is it makes it a lot easier to change out one setting without then having to go through and change everything everywhere. This is where your hand animation gets applied. It just sends it to the, here, we'll open that up. It sends it to the hand animation. It sends data about your grip and your trigger and your target. And this is the same as in the last template. So depending on your activity states, we set different collision states. We update some variables. We open some gates. This is a gate for item targeting, which you'll see on the next one. And then this is more variable updating, which is useful for talking to items. Okay, so basic hand stuff and hand actions, or complicated hand stuff, I should say. Collision. So there's different types of collision. If you've got an open hand, you'll collide, and it has a certain kind of physics versus when you have a fist, it has a different kind of physics. This is not physically true, like it shouldn't be this way. I've decided to make it this way by default. One, so that you have options, but two, because I think it makes sense, especially if you're in a zero-G game, to not penalize the player for accidentally touching the wall, because they don't really have a lot of feedback. So if they're touching the wall but they're not making a fist, it won't affect them as much as if they are making a fist, and then we'll say, okay, they meant to touch the wall, they're trying to push themselves off. That's how that works. Plane sliding, this is just basically normal sweep collision, but for hands. And if you're holding an item, then your item will call either this or one of these to decide what kind of collision you're going to get. Like maybe you'll have no collision, and maybe you will, but that's up to the item. And then that way we don't have to have a million things on the pawn side. Every item can just select one or the other. Anchors, again, this is when you're climbing up the walls. This is how they get set, how they search for the right thing, how they find it, and then once you are anchored again, we'll go back to body movement. This is what actually makes you move. Wait, is that not called on tick? Oh, it is called on tick. I just moved it to this page with all the other weird movement styles. Did we finish up hand actions? Anchors. There's vaulting, I think, is down here. If you throw yourself off of an anchor, it'll push you, give you a little speed. Item targeting. This needs some cleanup on my part. I apologize for this. The gist of it is that your hand, when it's in the correct state, that is to say, when it's open, it's going to search for It's going to search for targets in front of it, and it's going to cycle through them until it finds a valid one. And then once it does find a valid target, it's going to say, okay, this is my new target. And at that point, it's going to decide, okay, am I gripping? Or is my action target holding? So not necessarily gripping, whatever you've set the holding action target to be. In this case, it's gripping. Um, and if the answer is yes, then you'll send the grip message to that item over the server, and that gets replicated over here, and then it sends a message back and it says, okay, here's all my info. You can update your variables. And we'll get into items later more. Buttons are another type of item, but they're different because basically your pointer finger just tells the button where it is, and then it updates itself. And these are some things I wanted to fix. This is some of the replication stuff for buttons. I want to say that's it on the pawn side. Sorry, I know that was like drinking through a fire hose, and my less than excellent coding style doesn't make that better, but hopefully you know which things at least exist now and where to go look for them when you start having issues. And then, of course, always just come into the Discord and ask questions. I'm usually online and trying to be helpful. Okay, items. We'll look at the item foundation and just give you an idea of how it works. At the beginning, every item has a collection, as a subcomponent map, and the map consists of subcomponent logic, and the key is always whatever the mesh is. And so every subcomponent will actually consist of a highlighter, a hand, a scene, and a mesh. And they'll each do different things. Like the hand reference is for you to get an idea of where you want the player's hand to be when they grip it. And so this just helps you to move it to the right spot and say, okay, grab the location of whichever bone. That's where I actually want this item to be gripped when it's picked up. And then you basically only use it for that. So anyway, if you saw the previous item tutorials, this one's very similar with the exception that rather than having a different actor for each subcomponent, we have one actor that just carries many subcomponents in it, and it just cycles through them. So anyway, you've got these structs you can make that are just full of options. And so just by sort of filling out the options, you can get a lot of functionality very quickly. And the foundation one only has one, but if you look at the SMG, it's got actually examples of every type except for button, which is its own. All right, so moving right along. Logic setup, that's where we just were. It says, okay, I'm going to take all these things that you, the dev, decided I should do, and record that and do them. This needs to get a little bit fleshed out. What I would like it to do, as I wrote here, and it's what it does in the other template, is it does some other things automatically based on what you've picked here. So you may need to do things like making sure your collision channels and tags are correct when you set up things to attach. Okay, the server we'll call map load setup at the beginning. This is one of those things I talked about where it just figures out where all the items are, whether or not any of them want to connect to each other right off the bat. So for example, if you wanted to put a magazine and a gun right next to each other in the orientation where they would actually attach if it were in game, they will attach before the game starts. and then at the very end they'll all resume collision. So they all start with collision off, and they do that. That's at the start of the game. The in progress updater. This happens once your pawn joins, and this looks complicated. It's actually one of the least complicated things on here, despite all the spaghetti. Basically, it just says, okay, hey, a pawn joined. Let me know what your current state is. It says, okay, here's my current state, and it says, okay, well, let's just rerun these commands if they're applicable to you, and then let's tell that pawn where all your subcomponents are right now. Done. Okay. This is just variable setup. Okay, so on tick, and again, this is to update the transforms. That was here. That's for this. Okay. The meat of what this of how this actually works is here, is in the tick routing, where it runs through every subcomponent and it says, okay, am I being gripped? Is this version of my item actually running on the person who owns me? Because you want the person who's using the item to have the least what do you call it? The least lag, and then replicate it to everyone else later. But if you're manipulating a lever or something, you want the person actually manipulating it to see it moving correctly. And this is where it says, okay, do I need to drop? Like, for instance, if you let go of the grip button, if it's not sticky, it'll drop. Do I need to be manipulated? For instance, the charging handle on the gun. Do I need to move back and forth within constraints? Do I need to move the hand along with me? How do I need to move? How does the hand need to move? If it's a button, how does the button work? I feel like I tested this, but maybe I didn't. You should go ahead and test that. Anyway, the button just moves itself down to the lowest point that it's been given, and then if it stops receiving input, it resets itself. Too easy. One thing we might want to look at is that the pawn and the item actually talk to each other through an interface. And the first interface is check availability. We talked about this here. The first part is just checking. And if it comes back with a yes, I'm available, and it might say, the part you wanted was not available, but actually the primary part is. So for example, if you targeted a subcomponent before you're holding the whole item, the subcomponent will reroute you to the main item and say, okay, yes, I'm available, but actually you meant to target this. And it'll say, okay, well, if I'm gripping, then I'm going to send you this message, and it'll eventually get to the server as try initial action. And it's basically the same thing. And it says, okay, it double checks all that routing, and then it says, okay, what do I need to do? Do I need to get picked up? Do I need to get manipulated? What? And then if it does, then it broadcasts that to everyone and updates itself, and then you will see that reflected here in the tick routing, where on every tick it'll update itself in accordance with its current state. Button contact is just what you think it does. Try item couple is an item-to-item interface, so things like magazines and guns can connect to each other at the right time. This is going to be all, I think, for the orientation. And that's all it was. This wasn't meant to be a tutorial. This was an orientation. Tutorials will be forthcoming. I want to make sure that we settle on an initial release version before I put a few hours into making tutorials. I don't want them to change 1 week later. And I've already found some stuff that does need to change in some of the functionality. It's minor stuff, but I would be kicking myself if I spent a lot of time making tutorials and had to redo them. So please give it a try. Let me know how it's working for you. Let me know what needs fixed. Let me know if you need any template type features added. And ask any questions in the Discord. Thanks for trying this out.